Chapter 1, Focal Point and Placement. Let's talk about the focal point. If you look up the definition, it basically states that it is the center of interest or activity. It's a very simple concept, but it is one of the most fundamental principles when it comes to creating a picture. For this chapter, we'll talk about a few different ways on how different artists show their focal points. And there's usually two main ways. One way is to point at it. The other way is to frame it. Or just as common, it can also be a combination of the two. Looking back at some of the artists we featured during last week's lecture, we can see here with Edgar Payne's work on how he is using these principles in order to make it clear to the viewer on where he wants us to look. Starting with the artwork to the left, we can see in his painting that the clear subject is the man in the orange outfit. And from here, we can also see that the mules are creating this sort of arrow that points to that focal point. If we take a line through some of these rocks, you can see how it clearly points to the man in the orange again. Now it's really subtle, but pretty clear that you can also see certain arrows being created through all these sweeping lines of the mountain and the snow. He's also chosen to frame the subject against a blue atmospheric background with the mountains. Now, the artwork on the middle, as Bill Perkins pointed out, it's almost insultingly clear and obvious that he's using this large patch of light to point us in the direction of the group of people in the campsite. We can also see how they're being lit and framed by the shadow of the darker part of the cliffside. Moving on to the right and final piece, we can see these Native Americans and on their horses, how they're all being pointed with these arrows with the horizon area and the cliffside mountains. And this one has a more obvious framing where they are pretty much just dark shapes against a very light background, where their silhouette stands out very clearly against the sky. And on a more subtle note, they're also looking in the direction of the smoke. So that's also a sort of secondary focal point. You can see here with the clouds how he designed it to also be an arrow to help support that composition. So there's many things going on here on how he's taken us through his painting and how he designed it very clearly. You can also see the subtle framing and pointing of the foliage from the ground to our subject matter. Now, even though Edgar Payne was primarily a landscape painter, we can see here from the samples on how he added figures into the environment in order to give us a little bit of a narrative or to simply help us viewers relate to the scale and overall mood of the surroundings. Next up, we're going to take a look at American illustrator Mead Schaefer on how he used these similar principles just like Edgar Payne. Starting with the left piece, where we also did a study of this in chapter 6, we can see clearly how the figure's face is being pointed at and framed at the same time with this light in the back. We can also see how these shapes, as subtle as some of these are, they're basically just triangles which act like arrows pointing us to our subject. We can also see hints of his hands being framed against the darker background. As these are definitely secondary focal points in order to tell more about the narrative of the piece. Next, in the center piece, we can also see our subjects being pointed at with the rifles pointing from the outside of the frame towards the center where our subjects are. We can also see the framing of the foliage in the back against their silhouettes all the way across. From there, we can also see interesting shapes happening that kind of take place of an arrow. Again, leading us to our main focal points. Now, the reason I like this one so much is with all the textural quality and colors, you can see how he's really planning things out in terms of how he's designing his shapes in order to support where the viewer is supposed to look. And finally, to the right here, we can clearly see our subject being framed by the lighter background and also being pointed at by these sharper arrows. We can also see this shoe or part of the leg and kind of telling us a little bit of the narrative, but also again pointing straight at her. So this one, as chaotic as the scene looks, there's definitely a lot of organization happening to make the focal point as clear as can be. We can also see how her face is being framed and pointed at with an actual frame in the background. So just like the Edgar Payne landscapes, we can see these principles being put to use in order to direct the viewer on how to move around in this painting to make it interesting and clear. Before we take a look at more samples, I'm going to introduce a few tools that a lot of visual creators use in order to place their subject. The first tool is known as the rule of thirds. You've probably heard of this as it's commonly used in photography and even filmmaking. Basically, you would divide your frame into thirds, both vertically and horizontally with lines. From there, you can place your subject and focal point in one or more of the intersecting areas where the lines meet up. As you can find here, in this photograph that I took, I placed my subject matter in the upper right corner, which is the clock tower. Another placement tool that artists have used is known as the golden ratio or the golden mean. Basically, with scientific findings from hundreds of years ago, a certain mathematical ratio was found to reoccur in nature. This golden ratio has been used by many artists, musicians, and even architects in the past in order to help them compose their creations. Now, you can look up the actual equation or ratio of the golden mean, but after the means of constructing it, or using a template as you see here, a certain spiral is created and points to an area that feels natural. So similarly to the rule of thirds, this can be used to place your focal point. And as opposed to staring at your focal point in the complete center or far into the corners of a frame, it helps the audience view the image a little bit more naturally. Just to show a quick sample on how you can even use this for a bit of post-editing, I've gone ahead and taken an old photograph that I took and recropped, resized, and moved around a bit in order to superimpose the golden spiral on where I want the viewer to find a certain focal point. Next up, let's take a look at these three artists and how some of these placement tools are applied. Now if we were to divide Edgar Payne's painting here into thirds, you'll notice how the subjects are lined up on the bottom left corner where those lines intersect. And interestingly enough, the horizon line is also in line with the bottom thirds of the painting. With Franklin Booth's pen and ink, we can see dividing this into thirds also reveals our focal point from the bottom right corner and also to the top left on where the characters are looking up into the sky with the large clouds. Now, when we look at Andrew Wyeth's work, we also notice that the clear focal point is the bell. And if we superimpose the golden spiral and turn it upside down, which pretty much does the same thing, it pretty much goes to that exact point. Now, whether he actually used this or not, this is basically where he placed it for the viewer to see that main focal point. And just to add to this, looking back on what we covered from the first few minutes of this chapter, we can also see the certain arrows that are sort of hidden to direct us to the certain areas of the painting. So just like the whole landscape, Edgar Payne is using them to point to our subject, which creates that narrative. And even as little as this purple part of the cloud was very intentional in order to create a strong direction into our subjects. And just drawing over Franklin Booth's piece, we can also see the same thing with the road. As well as a lot of these amazing curves that point back and forth to our subjects. So you can see how he carefully designed the curves of this tree to make it look elegant, but also just to disguise these arrows that help us navigate through his artwork. And for Wyeth, it's very simple, but there are very strong diagonal lines that was intentional, both created by the natural setting, but also even some of the cast shadows to point us to the bell. Before we end the chapter, let's take a quick look at some samples from film and television and how some of these are being used as well. In this screen capture of John Wick, we can see that by dividing the frame into thirds, he is slightly off center and in line with those right intersections. But more importantly, we can see the lights in the background pointing and framing him in order to help us viewers spot him quickly in the scene. Next up, we have a screenshot from the TV series The Pacific. And here, we notice that the main subjects of our shot are also slightly off to the right of center, just like the scene in John Wick. And this is also a very simple solution, but with the set design and lighting that they have set up, us viewers are able to immediately focus on the people framed by the background. Last but not least, we have a screen capture from the movie Star Trek Beyond. In this scene, where there's a lot of movement happening, we have the character Jayla simply being framed by the background. She's also being placed and framed by the foreground character to the right and also the tree to the left. Now, as simple and natural as these look, we have to remember that the cinematographers, set designers, and directors paid a lot of attention to detail in order to make the shot read really clearly in even a split amount of seconds. Just a quick recap for this chapter. We've gone over some quick principles of the focal point and how different types of picture makers use certain ways in their overall scene in order to help us viewers find their focal point clearly and effectively.